I think it's working. We're very new to this technology, so forgive us if things just go a bit odd. But so the first part of the question is just generally like, what are the Creative Commons? It's a phrase that you probably have heard. It's a phrase that you've seen on websites, and you've seen the little CCBY um, tags on the bottoms of things. And you hear the phrase, and it kind of means different things to different people. And we're going to kind of go into Creative Commons as an organization, as a philosophy, and specifically as the license, which is how most people want to use it. So, um, first is the organization. Started in 2001. The Creative Commons organization was founded because of certain things going on. We'll look at that in just a second. But it was this group of people who were interested in freeing up creative and scientific endeavors to kind of free them slightly from kind of the statutes and some of the changes that were going on with copyright law and um, some of the other developments with like the internet. So it's a nonprofit organization that is involved in a lot of different ways to try to sort of free up intellectual property law. It's not necessarily trying to, remove copyright and stuff like as we'll discuss, but it's an organization that's looking into ways that we can take artistic endeavors, scientific endeavors, we can make them more free and open and more clearly so, because that's one of the problems kind of prior to stuff like the Creative Commons. You had this issue where if you wanted to share your stuff more freely, you could type something at the bottom of your website or your images saying these may be used for such and such use, and there was no real collective like solidarity with how people use them or what people wanted to get out of them. So the organization was dedicated to how do we make this more instantly readable, like more understandable, more approachable, so that everyone can do this, and it's not just people who have law degrees or people who are just throwing things out into the wilds of the internet and seeing what comes out of it. And so we were talking about some of these things going on, and so this is kind of some of the philosophy. Now, Creative Commons wasn't the first organization to have these sort of open licenses. There's been various movements as long as there's been stuff like copyright for this kind of thing. But Creative Commons came about at a time in which you had a lot of forces coming together. So the big one there at the bottom is the internet. Like the internet, so this is 2001, remember, and it's coming out of actions that were taking place through the late 90s. So the internet's getting big. Everyone's getting exposed to a lot more of everything. You had in the 90s, you had another extension of copyright law, the terms of copyright. So it had gotten to a point where it was the life of the author plus, I think 50 years, and then it became 70 years. So essentially, if you like to put it like, I was born in 77, something written in the 50s will probably not lapse from copyright until after my death. It's that kind of thing. So, you're looking at this, and it's 120 years for anonymous works or works made for hire. So you get this thing where you will live your entire life with most every creative thing built will be in copyright until after you die. So for kind of a free culture perspective, you were reaching a point where it was hard to juggle just reusing anything. Like, and that worked really well for big works like Disney movies and such. But for smaller people, it basically meant their stuff would be in copyright and unshareable until well after anyone would care. So you had that going on. You had the copyright terms extended, and you had internet coming up. You started having, with the internet, increasing amounts of international communications. And even though there were things like the Berne Convention, and there were certain methods to sort of juggle conflicting copyright laws between countries. You had issues where there were times in which copyright laws would clash from one country to another. But you also just generally had creators wanting to share their stuff more freely on the internet. You had an even bigger increase in remix culture. The internet brought about things like fandoms, where people could get together and talk about their favorite bands, their favorite movies, and so people wanted to make, the memes, yes, but also just kind of serious dedications to these things that people love. But it's a problem if when you make a fan production about something you love and you get hit with copyright lawsuits. And so I've got up there in the kind of red splash IP lawsuits. The big heyday of those came slightly after the rise of Creative Commons, but still it was something, in the works, where you create this fan creation or you create whatever, a parody, stuff that would normally be treated under fair use, but because the internet's kind of in a Wild West stage, you're often seeing people like a freezing of culture, as it were. And so you had all these kind of forces coming together, and so the philosophy is sort of, how do we rectify this? How do we make something that says, this person's in one country with a set of copyright laws, I'm in this country with a set of copyright laws. We want to get together, we want to share, we want to release our works more openly without confusion amongst our fans. We want to engage in remix cultures. We want to sort of fight back against copyright terms being indefinitely extended, which is good for multi-billion-dollar companies, but may not be so good for me, who has a book that only a few hundred people will read. And you had all these things coming together. And from that, you get the licenses. And we will go a bit in depth into these. So for right now, you can just kind of glance at them and let them soak into your eyes just a bit. But you ended up getting these certain licenses that were like little buckets of rights you wanted to give to your users to use the material that you created. An important thing to know about a Creative Commons license is this is not meant, and in practical terms, it isn't a replacement for copyright. You're not releasing something to Creative Commons or copyright. You're releasing something, when you create something tangibly and you release it, it's copyrighted just automatically by the nature of copyright law. Creative Commons is a way for you to label exactly how you are okay with people using your work openly. Cory Doctorow, who was there initially with the Creative Commons group, and he's worked with a lot of like open access, open source kind of endeavors, and he released Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom to Creative Commons. It was a very early example of a commercial work being released to the Commons. He describes it as like a robo-lawyer. It's sort of a boilerplate template that millions of people can use, and it means the same thing for everyone. So whenever there's a question of, does Creative Commons override this, or does Creative Commons get rid of my rights for this, the answer is no. There are some exceptions, and we'll kind of look at a couple of the exceptions, but generally speaking, copyright still exists in whatever country you're in, and then the Creative Commons is just sort of a way to tell your user, hey, you can do this with it. So just a very brief timeline, like we don't need to go into the nitty-gritty of every specific aspect. Just some things to kind of keep in mind is, all right, so 1989, you had the GNU Public License 1.0 launched, and this is kind of the template that a lot of the free licensing movement will reuse and reuse again. It's basically this notion that, in this case, software, though it got extended to include other works, but originally software could be made in such a way that people could reuse it, study it, break it down, share it, without being in violation of the rights of the people who put it out there. And this is sort of the backbone of like Linux and the free software movement, which ends up being the backbone of a lot of commercial software, because a lot of commercial software nowadays uses this initially GPL kind of stuff, and the GPL allowed for certain methods of that, though we will briefly look at some of the many alternatives in a minute. And then in 1998, you had the Copyright Term Extension Act, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, or what they called that the Mickey Mouse Act, because it was supposedly to prevent Mickey Mouse from entering the public domain. This is sort of like the two big precursor echoes that led to the guys who founded the Creative Commons organization. It caused them to go all the way up to the Supreme Court trying to argue about copyright extensions and how it's actually hurting creativity instead of supporting it. And that's a debate for a more advanced video, but generally these are sort of the two opening shots. So 2001, Creative Commons is founded as an organization, and in 2002, they released their initial licenses. And again, we're going to look in those more in depth. By 2003, you had 1 million licensed works. So, it's getting out there, but it's not like taking over the majority of creative endeavor at this point. By 2007, you're up to 90 million works, and you're up to version 3. And we're not going to go into what the differences in the versions are, because honestly, I don't know all the nuts and bolts of what changed from version to version. 2008, Wikipedia adopts a CC BY ShareLike license, which we'll talk about. 2009, CC0, which is releasing something into public domain as defined by the Creative Commons license. 2014, you have the current version, version 4. By 2017, you have 1.4 billion works. I think the current number is something like 2 billion or somewhere over 2 billion. So it's one of those that's like, as it goes, Creative Commons is building up and there's more and more stuff out there. So it is important to realize that because Creative Commons isn't a replacement for copyright, it's an extension of copyright, that you get these ideas that are very similar and very related, but they're not they overlap, and sometimes they get mixed up, but they're not necessarily like conflicting ideas. So so you have the Creative Commons, which is a specific set of licenses that apply to copyrighted works by people who wish to engage in them. And then you have fair use, which is a specific usage of copyrighted works, which includes Creative Commons works. So for instance, you may have a Creative Commons work that says that in order to use it, you have to share alike, or you can't make a derivative. But you can still make a derivative if the derivative is in the concept of fair use. And that other symbol, that kind of strange PED symbol, which looks kind of like an infinity sign split in the middle, that's one of the symbols people use for public domain. There's a handful. I went with that one because it was the most unique compared to the other symbols. And the public domain is the thing that some Creative Commons works are released to the public domain. But that's more than what it's a much more free general thing that's outside of Creative Commons and is based on the back of copyright and other licensing things. So like the C also here is you have a lot of different other open style licenses that are open in different ways with different rules, and some are fairly specific, like you get the GPL is the big one, the sort of the foundational license that a lot of the others are similar to. You have the MIT license, you have the Mozilla license, then you get those that's like the Pixabay license, which Pixabay is a specific website that shares images freely, and some of the images I'll use in these slides actually came from Pixabay. They have their own free license where you don't have to give attribution, so you share stuff to that site, then you give up the right to expect attribution. And there's various reasons why people would do that. I'm a supporter of that kind of thing. I put things into the public domain pretty much instantaneously now. The C with a slash through is the unlicensed. It's a sort of an alternate version of the Creative Commons public domain license. where it's basically, you know, giving things for free. But then you also have things like the open gaming license, and other gaming systems and stuff will have a license that allows you to release things freely or reuse certain materials within the context of making games with that engine or with these certain pieces. So there's a lot of these other open licenses that are more or less open. And you see similarities to Creative Commons in these, but they're not necessarily the exact same. And when you're dealing with these other licenses, you can't necessarily assume that it's all open in the exact same way. And that's just a thing to keep in mind. So Creative Commons has some big adopters, some big websites that make use of it, either entirely or in potentiality. This is just a small sample. YouTube allows you to make videos Creative Commons. This video, as we'll discuss, will be released Creative Commons. Wikipedia's default license is, I want to say CCBySA. I just said it out loud a second ago in my brain, but I'm pretty sure that's the right one. The Internet Archive has lots of stuff in Creative Commons. PLOS, the Public Library of Science, has various licenses throughout, but you know, Creative Commons, and then there's some public domain sharing of the data. But you know, Flickr was one of the first big websites to allow people to publish things to the commons through them. Bandcamp has Creative Commons, but there's more than that. Like there's plenty of websites like eBay and stuff that will have some stuff in the commons, and you're just going to find it a little bit everywhere. All right, so kind of the heart of this talk, or one of the two hearts of this talk, is talking about the different licenses and talking about what some of these stipulations means, because I think this is going to be the biggest actual stumbling block from people either publishing things to the commons or using things from the commons. So this is just a bigger version of the image I showed before. Don't necessarily worry about it, but just this shows you how at a glance it doesn't mean anything. Like you got a picture of a person and buy, and you got a picture of, you know, a dollar sign with a slash through it. That makes kind of sense. You got like a kind of recycling icon. You might can work that out. The equal sign for no derivative. So you'll see these on a lot of web pages and a lot of things released into the commons. And it's the kind of thing that once you know the lingo, it makes perfect sense. But when you don't know the lingo, I don't know how anyone would know what any of this meant. So sort of the default, not necessarily the most popular, but sort of the default license is the CC BY, which is the with attribution license. So at this sort of default license, which is considered a free cultural license, as in it's one that inspires and promotes the concept of free culture, you have certain rights and capabilities. You have give attribution. So give attribution is sort of a default thing for most of the Creative Commons license. And that means you're free to use it in certain ways if you give attribution to the original creator. You know, in library terms, citation, but it's a little bit more specific than that. But it's you give acknowledgement to the person you get it from. And this is where I think a lot of people make a mistake with Creative Commons stuff. They essentially are wanting public domain, free to use stuff, and not to worry about it. But if you're using Creative Commons, you got to keep this give attribution in mind. All right, so your basic rights for the CC BY license is to use and study. And this goes all the way back to the GPL, these foundational license laws. So use and study is the idea that, you know, you get a book, you can read it, and you can make use of it, which is technically true of even just copyrighted works you get, but you get into these weird edge cases where you can use it to a degree, you can study it to a degree. And then when you get to this next right, which is share and copy, you're now getting outside of copyright real quick. But the idea that if I have a PDF of something, I can freely give it to someone else without worrying about it being against the law. I have a song that I like that CC BY, as long as I don't hide who the song's from, I can share it, I can reuse it in my own works, etc. And another one, probably, you know, like, so those two are like foundational rights. And then you get to the the other two rights, which are remix, adapt, and build upon. And these are game changers, because this means I can take something from the commons, like something from Wikipedia, something from, you know, the Public Library of Science. Music released a CC mixture, and I can make my own music. I can make videos that use this music. I can make movies that use the graphics, you know, and I can make money off of it. And this is where you know, like, it starts becoming, you know, it's kind of cool, because you have a freedom to do pretty much whatever you want with this material, as long as you give attribution. So probably the most popular license by most of the things I've seen, like when you look at the metrics, it's usually like this one or the non-commercial version of this one. And you're getting into sort of the old school, how the GPL kind of works style license. So this is the ShareLike. So it's got the same basic set of rules as the first one. You give attribution, you can use and study it, share and copy it, you can remix, build upon it, adapt it, you can make money off of it. But the wrinkle of this is, if you use these materials, you also release your final product into the Creative Commons. One of the things I've never been quite sure about is if you're supposed to also put the exact same license, so also a by SA. I don't tend to worry about that. I don't think most people who release things in the Creative Commons worry about that, you know, specificity. But that's the big update to buy, and this is why some people in open culture like it, because it makes the open culture sort of, and this sounds like a bad thing, but it makes it sort of viral. If something's popular and it gets reused in things that are also re-entering the open culture. The other sort of big branch off from the CCBY is the non-commercial use. So you notice we've lost the, you know, open culture, free culture badge at the top there. But in that one, you can basically use it for anything you want, as long as you're not using it for commercial purposes. And you still have the, you know, you give attribution, then you can use and study it, share and copy it, remix and adapt it. You don't even, if you do remix and adapt it, you don't have to release your creation into the Creative Commons. You just can't make money off of it. And so the question that comes out of this one is just, what does non-commercial use mean? And I guess I put my quotation on point, don't worry about it. But so the definition, the way that the Creative Commons license defines it is, non-commercial means not primarily intended for or directed towards commercial advantage or monetary compensation, which on the surface seems kind of immediately graspable and understandable. But in practice, you do run into a lot of questions with the modern internet. Like, I mentioned Cory Doctorow earlier. He one time got called out because he had posted some stuff for the Commons on his, you know, or on the Boing Boing blog, which is a commercial endeavor that he was working with. I'm not really sure what their actual employment structure was, but because there's advertisements and it's generally a profit-making enterprise, even though it's kind of dedicated to free culture, you do run into the question is that commercial? Like, this video is using Creative Commons images mixed in with stuff that I've created myself, but you run into the question is, like, YouTube will make some money off of it through advertisements that it kind of forces upon us to use. Is that a commercial use? You know, like, if a company is running a charity and that charity kind of is promotion for the company and they use something from the Creative Commons and their non-profit wing of a for-profit company, you know, is that considering? And there have been certain lawsuits and certain discussions about this. I included a link down there, the Wiki Creative Commons, you know, non-commercial interpretation. You can search for it on Google or whatever you want to search for it on, and you can see some of the discussion. Because again, it's not as straightforward as people would think it would be. But kind of moving on and building upon that one, you then have the one that combines those last two, non-commercial use and ShareLike. Again, very similar to the non-commercial use. You give attribution, you can use and study it, you can share and copy it, you can remix, adapt, and build upon it, but you can't make a profit. And if you remix, adapt, or build upon it, you have to release your product into the Creative Commons. As you can see, these first ones are kind of the same thing, just in different combinations. So the big twist, and one that has sort of a certain appeal for, I think, a lot of people, but sort of is also against the notion of free culture, is the CCByND, which is no derivatives. That's the equal sign. And this one, so if you have something CCByND, I can, as long as I give attribution, I can use and study it, I can share and copy it, I can make money off of it. Like, I can take your image and sell it to someone, even though I got it freely from you, but I can't make a adaptation of it. It has to be in the original form. And that also probably gets pretty fuzzy. Like, if I took your image and stuck it on a t-shirt, is that the same image? I honestly, this is one of those more advanced talks, right? Like this, we could spend all day talking about the fuzziness of derivatives and commercial use. But yeah, so that, it's one of those things, like it's getting into kind of the slightly odd territory for free things, but it does still allow people to share things. Like if you want to release a book but don't want people to make a movie from your book, you release it in something like this, and then they can basically make copies of your book, but they can't make a derivative product that uses your book and potentially cuts you out of a future stream. And then of course, as you can guess, there is a version where they can release your book, but they can't sell it. They just have to give it away, and they can't make derivatives at the same time. So this is sort of the most restricted of the licenses, which is the non-commercial use and no derivatives, the BYNCND, which there's good reasons that people might want to use this, but it also it's like a way to make it so that people can share your music, share your pictures, share your books, whatever. But you're not going to be able to make remixes from it, and you can't make money off of it. And so, but in general, it is very restricted from that core concept of the commons. And then on the other side, we have the newest of the Creative Commons licenses, which is also one of the oldest licenses because it was the default license for most human endeavors up to copyright kind of started, and that's the CC0, which is public domain. The way it works, it is a public dedication tool which allows creators to give up their copyright and put their works into a worldwide public domain. So public domain means if I release something in the public domain, then you can use it freely. You can share and copy it. You can remix, build upon it. You can make money off of it, and you don't even have to give attribution. Now, just because attribution is not required, it doesn't mean attribution isn't sometimes the right thing to do. And that, but it's up to the user. It can be very important to say this, CC0 image by Doug Bolden is called Rainy Day, just to make it clear where it came from, to give context. But if I release it CC0, I am saying I'm not expecting you to do that. You can use it as you wish. And in that context, this talk that I'm giving right now, at least all of the stuff that I've typed, like my original aspects, I'm considering it CC0. Like, feel free to distribute this as you will. Pretty much everything I create, I tend to release like this because I'm extremely free culture. That's, my personal choice. All right. So now that we've kind of looked at these different licenses and we've looked at some of them, what they mean, we get to the question of which one do you want to use? And I mean this in both directions, right? Like, which one, if you release something in Creative Commons, which one do you want to use? And if you use something from the Creative Commons, which one do you want to use? And they're fairly similar questions, but there's different weights on either side. And the notion of how free you need a license to be, either to release something or to receive something, just depends on certain factors. And we were talking about some of those factors, right? Like, if you're looking for something that you just want to share with friends. You don't want to make a derivative. It may not matter to you whether or not there's a no derivative license on it. If you are releasing something non-commercially, it may not matter to you if there's a non-commercial. If you regularly release your own stuff into the Creative Commons, it may not matter to you if there's a ShareLike, because you were going to do it anyhow. But there are times where, say, you are making something that you want to make a profit off of, you need to make sure that it doesn't have a non-commercial. Like, you need to respect the commons as it is, because the more we respect it, the more we use it, the more we contribute to it, the more powerful it becomes, and the more clear it becomes to other people. So if you're going to be using stuff from the commons, there are certain questions you want to ask yourself. And the first one is kind of the big stickler, right? Like, will you have any issues getting attribution? Are you using this in some way that you would not be able to give attribution, or you wouldn't want to give attribution? And if the answer to that one is no, I don't want to give attribution, then basically you probably don't want to be dealing with the commons, because as we will see, that's the default for all of the licenses but the CC0. The stuff you're getting, are you going to be releasing any output using the material? Like, for instance, I've used, on purpose, I use Creative Commons images in this slideshow. And I am also releasing it, right? So anything that said no derivative, I couldn't have used in this slideshow, or I couldn't have used outside of the other copyright concepts of things like fair use. But the way I'm using these images are not fair use. There's the entire image. It's not a commentary on the image at all, and this is all on purpose, right? There's a fair use requires certain aspects. And if you're going to be releasing a product with this, you need to make sure that it allows derivatives. Is your use going to be commercial? And again, non-commercial can get kind of fuzzy. We're not going to worry about the fuzziness right now, but are you intending to make money off of it primarily? If so, you can't. You need to avoid the commercial usage. And if you are releasing a new product, whether or not to make money, are you okay with making it Creative Commons? And can you make it Creative Commons? Because sometimes, if you're doing it for a job, they may not allow you to release it into any licensing you want. Like, you can't release it Creative Commons if it's a work for hire and your job doesn't allow it. So confirm that you can do these things. And this is it's not really a flowchart. I don't even know what you would call this sort of diagram, but this shows sort of the way that these things crisscross and the way that they apply to the different licenses. Like, for instance, if you're giving attribution and you need a commercial use, you can't release it to the commons, but you are making an adaptation, then you want something that's got like the blue, yellow, purple, like that's kind of like the standard by sort of thing. And then as certain of those questions become no, then the application of the dots changes. And I've already said this basically, but the sort of heart of, like, probably better way to word this is the heart of reusage is attribution. That's the term that Creative Commons uses, as a reuser, creator, or user and a reuser. But a big part of using Creative Commons as a set of licenses created by a specific organization is actually giving attribution. And not only is that, nice, not only is that helpful, it's also, it's required by the license. But it is also nice and helpful. Because everything we create, whether they're scientific or artistic or political or whatever, it's part of a conversation. And when you cut off attribution, when you get these like massive like Tumblr posts and sometimes like Twitter conversations where stuff is being replied to left and right, and it's really hard to tell who's conversing with whom, it's hard to follow the conversation. And so when you're looking at like an artistic endeavor, when you have someone making a direct statement about a certain movement or a certain idea, and you remove the attribution that links that back to that initial creation, you're disrupting the conversation. Like, the conversation restarts there. And people can reverse image search and stuff, and people sometimes do, and sometimes they feel like they have to because so many people take things out of context. But like the commons, by that forcing that attribution at its core is sort of forcing a conversation of art, science, and etc. So if you're giving things to the commons, there's a number of questions you have to ask. And the first one is kind of like that attribution is the first big question about, whether or not you use something from the commons. The first big question, if you're going to give things to the commons, is are you okay with people sharing your material? Because if not, then maybe approach just regular copyright, regular trademark kind of things. But if you are okay with people sharing your material, you then look at some of these other things like, are you okay if people remix it? Are you okay if people make money off of it? Do you want people to give you attribution? And if people do remix it, for money or otherwise, do you want them to also give the same sort of licenses that you used to their works? And again, you get this sort of not really a flowchart sort of thing that shows how these things crisscross. It's not like a point A, point B, point C, point D kind of thing. It's like it's all bouncing back and forth, with the exception of the also Creative Commons kind of require someone to make an adaptation of it. But you get these, different weights, and it's up to you. It's whatever you feel comfortable with for the long term, is which one applies. And this just is another way of kind of showing that with like a different cut. Like, do you want someone to be able to remix it? Do you want a license required? Is it okay for commercial use? But not remixing, it's like this sort of Venn diagram. But the important thing is once you release something in the Creative Commons, it's irrevocable. So make sure you're comfortable with someone using your product for commercial usage. I am. Other people are. There's billions of works in the Creative Commons, so a lot of people are. But just make sure that you're comfortable with it, because you can't release something into the Commons and then go, you know what? I've decided I want to sell this book to a different publisher with movie rights, and I don't want other people to possibly make movies off of my work. Because at that point, you can't take it back. You can release another version of it that doesn't have the Creative Commons thing, and that's okay, but you can't take it back from that initial version of the work. So, usually a big question that people ask when they come to me at the library and they're wanting to engage in Creative Commons, they're not wanting to release works into the Commons, they're wanting to find things that they can use from the Commons, right? So this last little section here, we're going to take a look at some just different sources you can use to find materials in the Commons. And I'll talk about some caveats and some general, safekeeping kind of things, but sort of the one attached to Creative Commons website. So creativecommons.org, you go there, you click on the search for CC images link at the top, you come to this Openverse page that looks something like this, plus some extra stuff. And this is sort of your supposedly default way of searching. I will say that over time they seem to have used different backends, so I can't guarantee this is the backend that we'll continue to use. But you go in and you type in something and you get results that may or may not match what you type in. I will give a heads up, if you search for frogs, you'll probably find frogs, and you'll find things that have nothing to do with frogs that were tagged frog. And that's just the nature of the sort of automatic computer processing search engines. And one of the reasons I'm not doing live search is just because while preparing for this talk, there were lots of things that were not a match. And so I'm just not doing one now. But if you just go to creativecommons.org or search Openverse and find this, you can do your searches. And it's useful. Even though I'm kind of ragging on it because of the nature of matching, you will find images that generally match what you need, but also sound files and some other things. Another of the big ones, by sheer volume, maybe the biggest, it's either this one or the next one that's probably the biggest, is Internet Archives. It's, if you've heard about Internet Archives, you probably have heard it almost in a negative light, because a lot of times you hear content creators complain about Internet Archive sort of forcibly backing up stuff that people don't necessarily want to be forced up. But beyond that, there are plenty of things that are submitted legitimately to it that are in the commons or in the public domain. These are terms, even in the sort of official search engines, get very crisscrossed. Like, for instance, if you go to Google, which we'll show that in a second, and you search for Creative Commons images, you will find Creative Commons images, but you'll also find like Pixabay license images and other websites that have their own licenses. So it won't be stuff specifically Creative Commons, it's just stuff that you can freely use. This is the other contender for biggest one, and that's the Wikimedia Commons. It's the sort of open culture back end that a lot of images and stuff on Wikipedia come from. And it's another big source you'll find if you do like Google images searches, and you tell it just bring back, just Creative Commons materials. A lot of things go to Wikimedia Commons. You'll also find like Wikisource will have like public domain text and some other stuff like that too. Getting to kind of some of the more specific searches, like Flickr and Google Image are the two that I used because these are just the two that I use. But both of them have limiters in their searches for licensing. In Google Images, after you search, you click on Tools, and then it'll pop up a thing for usage rights, and you say all Creative Commons. And again, it's going to bring back stuff that's actually in the Creative Commons, but one of those 6 licenses I showed earlier, but also bring back things that have just generally accepted as open licenses. And these are 2 very quick ways to find Creative Commons images, though you usually have to click through to actually get to the page to get the information you need to cite things. I didn't go into details, but in that slide about attribution, when you're citing something in the commons or using something in the commons, you want to acknowledge the author, you want to acknowledge the link you got it from, you want to acknowledge which specific Creative Commons license it uses, and you want to link to the text of that license. So you usually have to go through the search engines and click on it to see the image itself to get that information, and you want to include all of those things for a legal Creative Commons thing. As people have pointed out, most people who release things in Creative Commons aren't wanting to nitpick that hard, but just for like appropriate usage and to help kind of keep growing that conversation, those are the things you need. So if you're looking for Creative Commons music, there's lots of websites that have Creative Commons music. Now there's also websites that have royalty-free music, which may or may not be kind of freely usable content. Usually royalty-free, I wouldn't even say usually, royalty-free can mean it's actually open music that you can just use, but it also can just mean it's music you pay a one-time fee to use, but otherwise can't use, and those are 2 different things, and you need to double check. If you Google search royalty-free music, make sure you're getting the actual open music and not music that you're going to pay a $100 fee to, one-time fee to use, but you're not having to pay royalties. But there's lots of different places that collect, Creative Commons music, not just royalty-free music, stuff that you can actually remix and reuse, put into your works, charge money to reuse, all those rights that we were talking about before, the different licenses. And 2 of them, CC Mixter and Free Music Archive, I picked those because those are kind of 2 of the bigger ones that I know of, but there are lots of others. For video, not including Facebook, probably the 2 biggest video streaming services. I don't know, Reddit maybe in here too now, but Vimeo and YouTube. Both of them have a option, kind of like with the Google Images and Flickr, where once you do a search, you can limit to just Creative Commons licenses. I've not tested in Vimeo to confirm that it's, that people tag that specific. If you see on the right hand side, it shows CCBY, CC, etc. I haven't really went through to confirm how correct it is. I know in YouTube you can choose to label your video as Creative Commons, which is a limiter. Now, downloading these videos to actually reuse may be a different story. Some Vimeo videos have a download option. I don't know if that's something you can do without using some sort of third-party, software on YouTube. I would have to go through just to see if you can make YouTube videos downloadable, because at one point in time you could, and then I think they took that away. I don't know if it's ever come back. just kind of showing, something else that's often released to Creative Commons are there is a volume released to Creative Commons. I don't know what percentage, but anyhow, like scientific research. So like these are just two examples. PLOS, Public Library Science plus one, is this big open access journal, probably the biggest open access journal. It's a pretty interesting thing because there's a lot of articles published to it all the time with various Creative Commons licenses, with a lot of the research released either to the Creative Commons or more public domain. And then the DOAJ is the Directory of Open Access Journals. I won't say that everything on the DOAJ is actually Creative Commons as opposed to other open access licenses, including some that would be like the GPL, some that are just their own hybrid license that they made themselves. But these are two big sources you could go and search for if you were looking for Creative Commons research. And again, this is the fun of the commons, right? Like you could take an article from PLOS One and use it as the basis of art. You could cut pictures out and reuse and stuff. Like, it doesn't have to be used in a specific way. Like the old licenses was like, oh, you may use this for educational purposes, and there was always kind of debate on what that meant. In this case, I can use something from PLOS One in a completely unrelated creative endeavor. And that, I think that's pretty cool. So I just want to give a quick shout here to, there's also a lot of scientific data through government websites that's usually covered through public domain. Though I have noticed that there have been some government related materials actually released specifically to Creative Commons recently. And that might be something like trying to encourage certain types of researchers to put works out there, but still retain some rights instead of giving up all the rights to them. Because used to, with government data, it tended to be you gave up all your rights, or you slapped some sort of like secret, your eyes only kind of tag on it, and then no one got to see it outside of the specific people. So this may be an attempt to find a middle ground, but that's something I just have noticed recently, that like some of like the NASA stuff is actually tagged commons rather than public domain. But in general, whatever type of media or wherever you're searching, then look to see if there's some sort of filters that allow you to narrow down your search. And you can go to the creativecommon.org, the CC's website. If you search for like music, or if you search for whatever, you will see other suggestions. Like I went there and I searched for music, and they had a thing that had like 20 different websites where I could go and get Creative Commons music. If you go to some website and you go to Google or Bing or whatever, and you search free music, and Pam, you get a search, and it says like free music, and then it gives you some options. Double check and make sure the license is actually free and they're not just using that as like a bait and switch. But also be very careful with some of these searches, because I have run into plenty of websites that will be like, oh, free music, just sign up here, and you start signing up, and then they want personal data like credit card information. Or when you download the images are kind of sketch, or inside of zip files that require like passwords to open, and it flags virus protection. So the sites that like I've talked about, the sites you'll find on creativecommons.org, tend to be verified. I won't say it's impossible to trick some of those sites into publishing sketchier things, but in general, like kind of build up a list of sites you trust, or when in doubt, you can come talk to us at the library and we'll help you find stuff in the commons that we can kind of back up. So this is basically, wrapping up here, because again, almost every one of those slides, it can be expanded upon and turned into an entire talk itself. But in general, that's just the surface of some of the ideas and history and concepts and philosophies. But if anyone has any questions that they would like to type into chat, they can go ahead and do so now. I'll be here for another couple of minutes, and then or if questions come in, we'll go. And in general, you could always find me, Doug Bolden at the library, physically in the building, or you can email me, doug.bolden@uh.edu, and I can respond there. We do have a LibGuide where I talk about some of the copyright stuff. I need to expand it to go more into the Creative Commons because it's a concept I support, and I have given talks before about copyleft and gone into the much more aggressively open licenses, while Creative Commons is kind of what you might consider a gently open license. But yeah, if there's any questions, you can throw them into chat and I will respond. But otherwise, thanks for attending. We're very interested in these online live streams. We used to give talks like this in-house all the time, and then, as the pandemic happened, those talks kind of got cut out because it was kind of hard to schedule around. But this is a way that we can kind of reach out, and then we'll continue in the future. The next one we have scheduled will be about conspiracy theories and the way that the internet has helped to inspire open culture, but one of the other issues of the internet is that it allows people to share ideas unvetted. And I'm not trying to come across as academically elitist, but we will be talking about the sort of rise of conspiracy theories in the information age, and I'll talk about some of the things like out groups and in groups, and the sense of protection, the sense of panics, and certain themes that happen. And then the next one we will have, so that one's going to be in early March, and late March we're going to have one about Great Depression era recipes, and some of the details that went into those. And then we're going to have one about Shakespearean authorship, like who wrote Shakespeare's plays. Spoilers, I think the answer is going to be Shakespeare, but I'm not the one giving that one, so there may be some plot twist in there. And then towards the end of April, we're going to have one final one, which is about Earth Day, but it's about researching climate change and using library resources and open resources to research climate, weather, and such. But all right, it looks like there's probably not any questions. Again, I'll type my, how do I chat? There we go. Let's see if, I think Google will allow me to do that. If that never shows up, just know that I tried to type my email address into the chat. But Google potentially just cut it immediately. Oh, I see it here, so maybe it did work. Again, you can email me and I can answer these questions. And if people have lots of questions or are interested and we get lots of views on this, we may do a part 2, like a Creative Commons 102, and then I'll go into more details about commerciality versus derivatives and stuff. But all right, well, thank you for coming out today, and we'll let this run for another couple minutes, and then we'll shut down the stream.